with the pool of games created specifically in the Republic of Ireland a bit limited, I scanned through the big list of games that I could attribute to that country and decided to check out a full tetralogy of racing games published for the PlayStation 1 because they were all developed by Funcom Dublin. Now, Funcom were in operation from their Dublin branch for just over half a decade between the years of 94 and 2001, and in that time put out exactly 4 games, and I played all 4 of them. Their first release was Impact Racing, which released worldwide in 1996 for the PS1 and Sega Saturn, for all the sickos out there, which is us too. Although the 32-bit machines have been on the market for about a year and a half at the time, Impact Racing feels distinctly early gen in both its design and visuals. So it's a stage-based combat racer. You're essentially cruising along very thin tracks, almost on rails. You're trying to destroy competition rather than overtake them, and your goal is always to beat the stage, arcade racer style, by hitting checkpoints to extend your time, whilst firing your machine guns at racers ahead of you on the track, dropping mines behind you to harm those behind on the track. And if you fail to make a time gate, it's game over. It's really, really simple. The visuals are very limited. They're very blocky. They're very kind of low polygon in presentation, the racers and everything else. And you're battling along these very linear tracks that exhibit pretty severe popping along the horizon as well. So it's not a looker. The music is very much the dance and electronic music you'd expect in a game released for the PlayStation in the mid-90s, which is nice as a throwback, I guess. But it's the type of game that is decently fun to revisit for half an hour, but has no substance to it whatsoever. It's not going to be on anyone's kind of like, gotta return to that list. I don't think it has any actual roots in the arcade, even if it feels like it, although write-ups on Impact Racing are pretty limited. There's not a huge amount out there, but it does very much feel like a developer cutting their teeth by trying to create a sort of arcade at home experience on what was still pretty cutting edge hardware at the time of release. It was not that far out from the original port of Ridge Racer and stuff like that.
Ridge.
If Impact Racing was unremarkable, Funcom Dublin's next game in 1999, much, much better. A kart racer called Speed Freaks, or Speed Punks in the US. It got a localization for some reason. And it fares much better in all regards. At first glance, you might remark a little unkindly that this looks every bit the kind of We Have Crash Team Racing at Home, which itself was kind of the We Have Diddy Kong Racing at Home.
Yeah.
But Speed Freaks actually beat Crash Team Racing to release by a couple months, which suggests a kind of weirdly parallel development between Funcom Dublin and Naughty Dog, both doing their own thing, but ending up essentially releasing the same game at the same time.
Yeah.
Crash definitely wins in terms of pure content, because it's got an adventure-style mode much more closely mirroring the single-player campaign of Diddy Kong. But Speed Freaks is a really good kart racer. It's a lot of fun to play. It's got really nice visuals. It's got a characterful cast of racers. It's got well-designed tracks that feel really good to drift around. I did struggle at first to get used to the way it handled, not because it's particularly tough to control, but because boost isn't something you build up through power sliding, but rather something you need to fill using collectibles on the track, which takes some getting used to when you're kind of hardwired for Mario Kart.
Yeah.
But everything clicked after a couple races. I then kind of started dominating the early difficulty tracks with snaking drifts, and it's just a really good B-tier kart racer. It's nothing special. It's not going to overthrow the greats, but it is a good time. I think of all their games, this was the one I had a memory of, not necessarily to play, but I'd seen maybe on a demo reel or in a magazine or something. And as a kid, it had stood out enough for me to go, oh, Speed Freaks. That looks like someone I'd be into as like a 10-year-old. Released in the same year, so 99 as well, came Funcom's next foray into racing. But this time, this is a licensed motocross game titled Championship Motocross, featuring Ricky Carmichael, everyone's favourite motocross racer.
Oh, yeah.
Now, motocross racers today do reasonable numbers because Milestone, who did the Hot Wheels game quite recently as well, they develop MXGP and Monster Energy Supercross games pretty much back to back every year. They have pretty much like yearly entries and have done for a long time. But I'm not sure what the market for Supercross was like in the late 90s. I don't know if it was a big thing. I don't know if it was a big deal. I cannot remember. The Championship Motocross as a game is marketed as a far more realistic take on motocross than obviously Speed Freaks was to racing. But the physics here are trying to capture kind of the sideways racing of bike sports and doing their best with kind of the limited hardware they're on. In execution, it still feels a bit lacking. Because whereas more modern motocross games are all about kind of deforming terrain that asks you to carve the mud on the track, almost like you're playing Wave Race, the limitations of the PlayStation mean that the cornering is pretty bland. It's a flat texture. You're sliding backwards and forwards over it. Nothing is changing lap to lap. And whilst it's perhaps a bit more realistic in the hand, it doesn't capture the drifting thrill I had with Speed Freaks, which seems odd given that they must have been worked on pretty much concurrently if they came out a few months apart. So it's likely the same team did both games, this and Speed Freaks, and this is just not as fun. It's definitely a case, we've had this conversation recently, about a realistic art style aging a game far worse as well, because the stylized graphics of Speed Freaks scales up really nicely to a massive display with its big flat shaded polygons and the characters really popping out the screen. But poor old Ricky looks a bit muddy and a bit wooden with his very sharp elbows and gritty texture from the PS1. And there's nothing really wrong with it. The whole game is fine. But whereas both Impact Racing and Speed Freaks approached the racing genre with a certain playfulness, I think the licensed grounding of Championship Motocross leaves it just feeling a bit flat, especially when you're returning to it 25 years on with the benefit of any sort of modern genre hindsight. It just doesn't really hold up, which is not their fault. It's just, that's how time works. Then finally, as a swan song for the company, in early 2001, Dublin Funcom returned with a follow-up to Championship Motocross, and it was basically the same core game with the same cover star, old Ricky Carmichael, but now it had 2001 on the box. That's the only difference. It iterates a bit on what worked and what didn't in its previous entry, and it kind of just calls it a day. It's not a lazy release in any way. There's more content, there's more licensed riders, there's more bikes, more tracks, so everything is bigger and better. Basically all the stuff a motocross fan might have been interested in back in the early 90s. But it's very hard to get excited about this sort of release now, in the same way that no one is looking back and splitting hairs over 2 mid-generation releases of FIFA. No one is going like, 97 was the one. No. It was 98 actually on the PlayStation that really, really pulled it out. They're just old football games at that stage. And I think for this, it's very similar. It's a bike game. It's a slightly better bike game. They're basically the same. If anyone is desperate to play a PS1 era bike racer, this is the better of the pair because there's more stuff in it. But it has all of the shortcomings I already identified. They still apply here. Sadly, 6 months after the release of Championship Motocross 2001, Funcom Dublin were shuttered. Although Funcom as a parent company do still exist and operate out of Oslo in Norway. So maybe we'll catch up with them in the future if we make it to Norway on a world tour. But yeah, the Irish contingent of the company is long since dead. But there we have it. Funcom Dublin, 4 races, arcade combat, kart racing, and a duology of realistic motocross sims. You can pick your poison with your PlayStation 1 emulator and pour one out for Funcom Dublin.
So realistic, you'll be picking your teeth out of the dirt.
Is that what the box says?
Yep.
That felt like sort of 90s marketing.
It did, yeah. Rad. Thoroughly rad.
Yeah.